With the release of Rune Factory 5, a lot of people have been wondering, is this something I should get into? Is it any good? Is it worth the time investment? Today, we're going to go into that. Now that I've beaten the game and the post-game dungeon, it's time for a review. So first, in order, today I'm going to describe what Rune Factory is about, then the good and the bad. To understand what Rune Factory is, you have to kind of understand what's going on in the farm simulation genre and a little bit of that history. So first, there was Harvest Moon. Harvest Moon was a cool game. You farm and, you meet some villagers and whatever, and that's it. The issue with Harvest Moon is that the gameplay never really evolved further than that. You just farm and talk to villagers. That's kind of paved the way for a new title, Stardew Valley, to take the spotlight. Stardew Valley is also a cool little farm sim game where here we still have the crops and all that. You get to customize some of the terrain. The main thing that sets Stardew Valley apart from Harvest Moon is the dungeon crawling aspect, where on top of the farming simulation, you also get to go through a very simple dungeon crawler with like little monsters, and you can get ores that can help you out on the farm in the little dungeon, and it's cute. This brings us to Rune Factory. Now, Rune Factory started out in 2006, so it's a lot older actually than Stardew Valley, but it has some of the core ideas that kind of set it apart from Harvest Moon. First, as you can see, we have our basic farm simulator. You have whatever crops. Like Stardew Valley, there's also dungeon crawling. However, it's a lot more involved and intricate than anything you'll find in Stardew Valley. You actually have involved stats and resistances and status ailments and all that, as well as big boss monsters that you'll fight in this kind of Monster Hunter style gameplay. And additionally, your livestock aren't just bought like in Harvest Moon. You have to actually go out and tame random monsters. So like, here's that boss monster that I was fighting just before. And she's ready to go plant some seeds and do some menial labor for me. You can have them in your party, you can ride them, fantasy action RPG style gameplay, and this is all separate from the actual farming sim. The way it all comes together is in the crafting system. So here, for example, I can make a broadsword with a slab of iron, and let's throw in a cucumber, because a cucumber gives +2 strength, and let's throw in a pumpkin for +3 strength, an eggplant for +7 strength. You put all of that together, and lo and behold, the broadsword that I just made with a cucumber, an eggplant, and a pumpkin has +12 strength. The farming also powers your cooking or medicine crafting, which allows you to cook foods that give all sorts of different buffs and related. One thing you'll need to know for the review is that a lot of your stats are tied to skill levels for things that you do a lot. Like if you use fire a lot, like fire magic, or cooking on your stove, or cooking on your forge a lot, then your fire level will go up, which will increase your max RP, increase your int, etc. And there are all sorts of different stats, including the hilarious sleeping stat that you get for literally just going to sleep, and the walking stat from just walking around that give you more base stats. In addition to befriending the villagers, you can also basically force them to be on your party. It's like, let's go on an adventure together. Now that we have a general understanding of what Rune Factory 5 is and how it fits in with the other farming simulators out on the market, let's talk about the good. First, the change to 3D really helped the combat system. Like in general, it's just a lot more fun to be moving around and dodging things dynamically in 3D with the way that they've implemented it. So the combat, I would say, is dramatically improved over Rune Factory 4. The next big comment is the UI. So everything in this game is designed to actually work really well with touch controls. So you see these gigantic buttons on the screen? There's a reason for this. It's because if you are in handheld mode, you can actually click on those buttons with your finger. If you're in these menus, you can just click on the thing you want. You can, with your finger, drag things around as you desire. This may sound like a small thing, but given that the Pokemon series, which is all about menu manipulation and moving Pokemon between boxes and all that, they have still not figured out how to use the Switch's touchscreen capabilities for some reason. This is a big plus if you play in handheld mode. The next big plus is that the gameplay loop is actually amazing. As I described before, you have to do farming. The farming lets you craft potions and craft dishes that you can use to assist you in dungeon crawling. Dungeon crawling gets you a lot of items that you can use to craft to help you with farming, as well as finding livestock that you can tame and grow on your farm. The main progression system is very straightforward. You talk to the dragon lolly, she has a little story moment, she tells you go to a dungeon. At the end of the dungeon, there's a new story moment, you go to a different dungeon, and so on and so forth. The thing is that the damage calculation is subtractive. So if your opponent has 1000 defense and you have 1010 attack, then you only do 10 damage. Unlike Monster Hunter, where, no matter how bad your build is, as long as you have enough skill, you can eventually take down an opponent. For the most part here, if you do not build a better sword, you will not win the game. You will not be able to damage an opponent, and there are mandatory gates where you're not allowed to progress unless you kill something. This generally reinforces the fact that you need to work with the crafting system to make something good. Another big thing in this game is that the waifu and husbando choices are actually pretty balanced. You have the vanilla option, the tomboy option, the furry option, you have decent bachelors, and then you have, for some reason, a literal child that I don't know why this one can be married. You frequently end up in situations where there's only really one good bachelor in other games. Like in Stardew Valley, if you're not picking Abigail, you're playing the game wrong. The marriage options in this game are actually somewhat balanced. That's the positive. Now let's talk about the negatives. First, and I'm gonna have to talk about the elephant in the room, look at these graphics. These graphics are not very good. The game devs looked at Pokemon Sword and Shield and said, this is the gold standard of what we want the game to look like. Like, a lot of people say, they're not that bad, and they're not that bad. But it's 2022. Like, I expect a little bit better than this, especially given point number 2, which is performance issues. This game does not run well on the Nintendo Switch. The performance isn't intolerable, but if it's gonna run poorly, I expect the graphics to at least be worth it. The only way to actually improve the performance to be somewhat tolerable is to go to the data management options on your Switch and move the data from your micro SD card onto your main system memory. Because if you don't do this, oh my lord, you are going to have a bad time. Another thing is that this game is very, very grindy. And one way to illustrate that is with stone and lumber. So there's all sorts of upgrades in the game for different areas that require material stone and lumber. You may ask, how do you get more stone and lumber? Well, dear viewer, you find these stumps that randomly spawn in the world on your farm, and for every individual piece of lumber, you need to slap that stump with your axe. And we do the exact same thing for stone. The issue here is that early game and late game, what we're doing to collect the stone and lumber is exactly the same. And you might say, well, Loup is not that bad, it's just a couple of systems. Then let me introduce you to the Carpenter and his extortionate prices for renovating the town. Combined, these upgrades cost 50,000 stone/lumber. And if you gather these materials at 1 stone or lumber per second, that's 14 hours! 14 hours of smacking a rock. And no, waiting for the RNG shop that sells every item in the game randomly to randomly stock stone or lumber at a very high price is not a viable alternative. Exploits do not absolve bad design choices. You don't need to grind this out, but there are so many systems in this game that just require mindless, repetitive tasks that you kind of want to function to play the game normally. And I'm gonna call it out, that's bad design. And remember that I told you about all these little skill levels? They directly impact your stats. On the topic of the game being grindy, Snoop completely disagrees with me and says I'm just doing it to myself. And I put it to a community poll, and the general consensus is that the game is somewhat grindy. And I feel like that's pretty fair. Now, whether or not you believe that I'm making the game grindy for myself versus the game is just kind of like inherently pushing you to grind, I leave that to the viewer. Next thing I'm gonna go into is the loading screens. The loading screens of this game are the bane of my existence. You'll notice that they're not really that long of a loading screen. The issue with these loading screens is how frequently they occur. Here, I'm just going from my house, just right outside the house. There we go. Now we're finally outside. Do you want to see why this is a problem? This is a farming simulator, so every day that you go to bed and you wake up, guess what you have to do? You need to check on your farms. So what we're gonna do here is I'm just gonna show you in general. Oh, it's a rain day. That means I don't have to water anything. We have to at least look at the crops to see what has to get harvested. I'm gonna just go outside, loading screen from my house to check the farm outside my house. Then I have to check the other farm, which is going to require another loading screen to get over here. I have to check my livestock in the first barn on this dragon, which requires a loading zone to get into this barn to, collect all their goods and all that. Then another loading screen to get from the barn back onto the dragon, and then another loading screen to get from the dragon into the other barn. And guess what? We got 5 dragons. We get to loading screen onto dragon number 2 so that we can loading screen into that barn, loading screen back onto the dragon, loading screen into the second barn, loading screen to the third dragon, loading screen to that dragon's first barn, loading screen back onto the third dragon, so on and so forth. There are so many loading screens every single day. The issue here is that when you get into late game or post game, where you are using all of this land that's provided to you, where you have a super end game build, you got all the barns, you're maxing out your livestock and all that, it is just so much loading screen every single day. This isn't like a one-time thing. Now let's say that we're done with the farming and we got to go buy a general set of things over at the town. So I'm going to warp over to the town. We're going to have a loading screen into the town. Then I got to go to the bakery for the daily recipe bread, loading screen into the bakery, loading screen back into the town, loading screen into the general store to get seeds, loading screen back in the town, loading screen into the florist shop to get flower seeds, loading screen back into the town to then plant the seeds, then all the loading screens onto the other dragons, and the loading screens never end. The loading screens don't stop. Early game, when you don't have that many farm dragons, it's okay. You can deal with it, right? Because you only have a couple of different plots to work with. But dear Lord, like in late game and post game, it is just so much loading. Rune Factory 4 does not have this loading screen nonsense, all right? You click on a farm, you're there. It's like Goku, instant transmission, and you don't have to incur all this time spent waiting through loading screens to do these things that you do every single day. My last major strike against this game is that there's so many mechanics that are really necessary and super cryptic, and there's no way you'd ever figure them out. You see that the crops actually have levels? The higher level of the crop, the more it sells for, the greater the effects and potions and all that, and it's a very critical mechanic, right? Would you guess that the main way to level up a crop is to cut it with a sickle instead of drawing it? So now I have instead a level 5 yam seed instead of a level 4 yam seed, and instead of plotting it, I'm gonna lose it forever by putting into the shipping bin. And if I do this, then it's going to be on sale at the general store, so that when I go to the general store, then I'll see level 5 yam seeds for sale forever from now on. In some of the quests, the game alludes to some of these mechanics, in a more friendly, figure it out yourself sort of way. But for really critical mechanics that are vital for the gameplay to function, it needs to be explicit. But you know what really takes the case? The mealy apple. If you do not go on the internet, you will never get this item or understand how to use it. The mealy apple is a special item where here you see when you upgrade it into a piece of armor, it gives you -10 to all your resistances. How do you even get this apple? First, you have to wait for a very rare weather condition of shooting stars, which has happened like once in my entire playthrough. Second, you need to wait until at least 8 p.m. on that day. Next, you could go anywhere in the world, but you need to go right here. And then notice that there's a black griffin right over there that looks pretty odd. And guess what? If you kill it, you screwed up. The mealy apple is a rare drop. It probably will not drop a mealy apple, and it will not respawn. So what you have to do is know that the black griffin actually already drops the mealy apple, and then use the stealing mechanic like this until by sheer RNG, you get a mealy apple, and then load back in over here. If you didn't get a mealy apple, you keep loading over and over and over and over again until eventually you steal the right item. And once you have a mealy apple, how would you even use it? Well, dear viewer, what you might not know, because it's not written anywhere in the game, is that if you upgrade a weapon with Object X, which is a failure item, it reverses the effects of anything you upgrade that weapon with after the fact. So if you forge something with Object X, and then later put a mealy apple, all the minuses are positive. So you have to know all of this in order to get the benefits of the Mealy Apple's elemental resistances. How would you ever figure this out? Ever? And this is just one example of how the game does this. Like, you need the internet to play this game. If you do not look things up on the internet while playing this game, you will not have a good time. So closing notes, Rune Factory 5, is it good? Despite my ranting, it is fun to play, but it is inferior to Rune Factory 4, which is a very, very similar game in every single capacity, except Rune Factory 4 does not have major performance issues like Rune Factory 5 does. And so you know, Rune Factory 4 was recently remastered for the Switch. Despite all the negative things that I had to say about the game, I would still say I had a good time with it. So should you get it? Rune Factory 4 is better. Hope you like this kind of content, and I'll see you guys around later. Bye-bye!